So I'm going to start that. Okay, so just let me know. Drop a chat real quick, guys. Oh, your name is Russ? Okay, that's a lot easier to say. Thanks, Russ. How many of you currently right now are using smart objects? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to see in the chat there, I should say. Um, Curious to see if this is something you guys are using. And if you are, maybe there's something this week I'm going to show you that's a little bit new. So what we're going to do is I'm going to give you a couple of reasons, number one, why we should use smart objects, and I'm going to show you little tricks and things that we can do with them. So right now we've got this picture of a jet. Now, I'm going to assume, based on the demographics and everything like that, that we've had that most of you, I'm going to guess 70 to 80% of you are photographers, and the rest of you are designers or other things. Just let me know. Just drop that into the comment and let me know what you guys do. So there's different ways of using smart objects. Smart objects can be beneficial for photographers, for designers, for motion graphics, for all kinds of different things. And of course, we use Photoshop for so many different things, you know, for medical. Gosh, we've got so many different things. So one of the things that we tend to do a lot is that we tend to scale things up and down, right? So trying to get things exactly the right size. I'm just going to duplicate this layer. Control J, just to make a copy. So we've got two of these jets just to give a comparison. Okay, so we're going to grab that top jet. I'll move that layer to the top just so it's not confusing for you. And this is what happens. This is what people do. We hit Control T, that's Command T on the Mac for free transform, and then we scale it down. And then we're like, you know what? I think I want a little bit bigger. How many of you do this? Come on. And you're like, I'm going to do it bigger. You know, maybe I want it smaller again. You know what? I'm going to put it back to its original size. And look at this. Look at the quality difference. If you can't see that, let me make it a little more obvious. I'm going to scale all this way down really tiny and hit the Enter key. Then I'm going to hit Control T and I'm going to bring it back up. Now you can't even read what is on that tail, but I can tell you right now, it is definitely pixeled AF. I just noticed that. Forgive the bad humor. All right, but look at it. It's super pixely. So this is a little bit exaggerated, of course, because I took it really small and then really big. But multiply, you know, I don't know how many times we change just a little bit, just a little bit, just a little bit. Every time you noodle with it, you lose quality. So I'm just going to move this to the top. And I'm going to pull this one to the bottom. And now I'm going to duplicate this. And I'm going to drag this one to the middle. Now we're going to do the same thing. But what I'm going to do this time is I'm going to convert this to a smart object. And the way to do that is to go under the thumbnail, not on the thumbnail, but on the name, right click, and then you're going to see this option, Convert to Smart Object. Now, smart objects, if you're in Photoshop CS6, you have smart objects. Smart objects have been around since, I believe, you know, I'm going to put myself out on a limb. I'm going to guess Photoshop CS2. Does anybody know? Drop it in there and let me know. Maybe even before that. Maybe Photoshop 6. I actually forget. So we're going to convert that to a smart object. So now that it's a smart object, what is happening is now when we change something, it's actually created a reference, and it gives you this little icon. See this little icon? So when I'm changing this, what it's doing is it's changing the pixels. So that's why it gets pixelated, it gets soft, it gets crunchy, because we're manipulating the pixels. But when we go to a smart object, it's referencing that image. So it's not directly touching it or changing it. Let me show you what I mean. Control T, Command T, and we're going to go down. Let's make it really small. So this should definitely lose some quality, right? Control T, let's go back up. Let's go to there. Let's go back down again. Let's go really huge. And let's take it back to the original size. And look at that. It hasn't lost any quality at all. So the number one reason you want to use smart objects is because it preserves the pixels. It's what's known as non-destructive editing, meaning it doesn't change the pixels. It doesn't destroy the pixels. This clearly is destructive. And maybe some of you have been doing composites and collaging, and we used to do these annual contests every year. Some of you probably remember the design challenges we did. They got pretty crazy at one point. We got up to $30,000 worth of prizes. Maybe we should start them again. I don't know. Let me know. But anyway, sometimes the entries would look like this. They would end up soft because you're noodling them, you're adjusting things, trying to get them right. And the number one thing you want to do is maintain your quality, and smart objects are the best way for you to maintain your quality because they're going to be nice and crisp. Okay, let me ditch this because we don't need it. So right now we've got a regular layer and a smart object. What's another advantage of a smart object? Another advantage of a smart object is that if we want to apply filters. So let's say I just go to this regular photo here. Let me make a copy just for safekeeping because I just want to keep that in there. And say I want to add a blur. So I go up under here and I choose filter and I blur and I want to give it a little motion blur. Sounds like fun, right? So let's give it a motion blur. I hold down the shift key and I give it a blur. Okay, click OK, that's cool. But I don't want the front to be blurry. I want the front to be sharp. Well, we have a problem. The only way I can really fix this is to go into the history brush, and let me show you if you guys haven't used the history brush. Go into the history brush panel, go up under window, and then we're going to go to history, and then we can go to, here we are, there's the motion blur. So right before it, why don't we click on there, and we could paint back the front. So now we've just got the blur on the back of the jet. So I didn't know if you guys knew you could do that, but that's what the history brush does. But what if I do this to the smart object? Because the thing is, later on I decide, you know what, I just want this whole thing sharp again, and I closed the document and reopened it. Guess what? When I reopen it, this history panel is going to be wiped out. It's going to be gone. Of course, what we used to do back in the day is we would go under here, we'd create a snapshot of that state, and then that would create the snapshot that we could go back to, and that would be saved. So that would enable us to do that. But a better way of working is if we go up here under the smart object and we choose filter and we choose to blur and choose our motion blur. So there's our motion blur. Let's apply it. Looking good. Now, here's the thing. If I decided, I want to go in here and mask it out, I can select that mask. Let me just grab the brush. Just a regular brush is going to be the B key, and make sure we've got black selected. Now I just paint in here. What am I doing? I'm just painting on the mask. So a layer mask usually sits beside it. With a smart filter, it works the same as any layer mask, except it goes underneath. And then we can just paint it back here and just say, you know what? We want the blur at the back. I should have used a softer edge brush. I can actually fix that just by double clicking here and just feather that, and I'll just smoothen it. See that? Just smoothing it in. So we've got these kind of things that we can do there. It's very nice. So we've got this flexibility. But here's the thing. What if I decided on both of these, I want to increase the amount of blur? I'm in a little bit of a problem here with the regular one because if I've saved it out, the history state is not really going to restore everything I need. So I might have to start again and just reapply the filter. But if I'm working here in the smart filter, I can double click on motion blur. It will bring up the filter and I can change it. I can increase it. Yeah, I can change the direction. I have complete control over this filter as if it's the first time I'm applying it. And this is one of the beautiful things about using smart objects. And I would say the second compelling reason that you would want to use a smart object is the smart filters. Now there's another thing we can do with smart objects. Let's take it even further. So why don't we go down here? I'm just going to get this layer. I'm just going to copy it here. And so it's just regular. I'm going to convert it to a smart object. And one of the things we like to do, and let me show you what I'm going to do here on the layer. In fact, I'll get rid of all of these. Just keep things nice and clean because we're going to go further down this rabbit hole. And this is the nice thing about doing these live streams is, we can just keep trying different things. And by the way, if you guys have questions regarding smart objects, drop them in the comments here because I will look at those questions in just a moment. Okay, so we have one here is a smart object and we have one here that's not. So an effect I showed you guys last week was, I like to call it the magical glow. And what I do for that is I duplicate the layer, I change the blend mode to overlay, then I go under the filter and I add a blur. Now I'm going to choose filter blur. Where's that? Blur, 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 Gaussian blur. And it creates this kind of a cool, just kind of a dreamy effect. It makes it look kind of translucent, little waxy, looks kind of nice on people, different things. It's a nice effect to use. But notice I had to create a new layer. I had to apply some effects. And it took 2 layers to create that. Here's a nice thing. I'm going to get rid of those. Here's a nice thing about using a smart filter. What I'm going to do is I'm going to apply the blur directly to our photo. So we're going to choose filter, blur, and we're going to apply that Gaussian blur. And I'm going to hold down the Alt or the Option key. Actually, it wasn't the Alt. Yes, it was. The Alt or the Option key, what it does is applies the filter with exactly the last settings that you used. So anyway, I'm just going to increase it a little bit more. So let's go here. But right now, all I've done is I've just blurred this, right? It just looks bad. But here's a nice thing. See this little icon? If we click on this icon right there, right next to the name of the blur, the filter, it brings up blending options. And now I can go here and I can change this to the overlay blending mode. Look at that, and then we get that effect, and I can fade it by using opacity. So this is almost like having 2 layers in one, but we're only working in the one layer. So that gives you some things. Okay, let's look at some questions. I got another thing I'm going to show you in a second here. No, it does not increase the file size. That's another beautiful thing about the smart object. All of these smart objects that we've been creating are all referencing the same image, and I'll show you what I mean. So let me just hide this, and we got our smart object with our jet, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hit the Alt or the Option key, and I'm dragging out copies. So now I have 3 copies of this smart object. So here's the thing about a smart object. If you want to get to the image, because remember it's a container, and so we're applying the filter, we're applying all these effects to the container, we're not applying it directly to the pixels. So double click on the smart object, of course you can tell because of the icon, and what it does is it opens up the original image in a separate document. This is the linked image. Now remember, right now we're using this with pixel layers. You can use smart objects with text layers, you can use them with vector layers, you can even bring in Illustrator documents and link those. You can use PDFs. There's so many different things. Video, animation. Check out my animation tutorial from this week. Check that out. And I'm actually using the jet, but not this one, a different one. And I didn't use smart objects, I don't believe, on there, but I do have other tutorials where I have used smart objects with the animation, and you can do some really cool things, but that's beyond the scope of what we're doing here. So, okay, so now we're looking at the nested object inside of this smart object. Okay, I'm going to do something crazy. Why don't we go in here, we're going to apply an adjustment layer, and we're going to do hue saturation. So what I want to do with the hue saturation, see these little bits of the yellowy kind of color here? I want to change this. So I'm going to click the little finger thing, click on it in hue saturation, and I'm going to change the hue. So it's going to change the color of the area I clicked in. And why don't we go here, give it a little more saturation. Why don't we take it to a different color? That's great. So we're going to make it, well, let's make it something. There we go. There's a different color. That looks good. And now if I play with this, see how I can just refine it to exactly that area. So now it's just affecting those. So this selects the color range. Different tutorial, but I'm sure you guys have seen me do this tutorial before, changing the color. All right, cool. Well, what's the big deal? Well, let me save this. So I've saved it. Now let's go back to our document. Look at that. All 3 of these jets have been updated. Well, how did that happen? That's because I'm linking to the individual smart object. So now can you start to see another use for these smart objects? A very compelling reason to use them is if you want to change multiple things at once it gives you the power to do that. So here's the crazy thing. Right now, I'm just working with embedded smart objects. I can actually create smart objects in the library. So I could drag one of these smart objects into the library. Um, and see how it changed now? Now it's got a cloud icon. What happened there is it's now become a library linked smart object. So that means if I change that, and all I did is I dragged the smart object from the layers panel into the library. And notice it's now got a cloud icon. That means it's synced. So that means if I have a million documents that are using a smart object, for example, a client I worked with for many years, Toyo Tires, I did all their print work. Well, not all of it, but a lot of their print design work. And so I did all their brochures, their flyers, posters, things like that. And very often you would change something. Like they would update a logo. Or maybe they would change the name of a new tire and they would put a TM on there. And then they would say, well, the legal department said we don't want the TM anymore. We want the Circle R, the registered trademark. So I had to go into every one of those documents and find that and change it because they didn't have library linked smart objects. But now that we have library linked smart objects, I could have that object in there and just create a new library. Of course, you can create libraries very easily. Just click on there and create a new library for each client. And then all I need to do is change that one logo and it would ripple through if it was library linked, and it will update every single instance of that in every document that uses it. I don't know about you, but I find that quite useful. Now I'm just going to undo. I just hit Control Z to undo it. Notice we're back to the local smart object, which is an embedded smart object once again. So what I'm going to do this time is I want to change this, but I want to show you something. Let me just close this. Well, actually, I'm not going to change it. Let's go back. We're going to just hide that. Control S for save. Click it. Now everything goes back to normal. All right, so what if I want to nest these smart areas? We're going to go down the rabbit hole here. Let's make some different sizes. So I'm just changing. I just hit Control T, and I'm going to resize this one. I'm going to make this a little smaller. And what it does is it just hides the smart filter while you're doing that. And let's make this one a little bit bigger. Okay, so we've got a formation of jets now. Okay, so why don't we just put them in formation a little bit? So they're kind of flying like that. Now I can take all of these smart objects. All I did is hit the Shift key and click the bottom one. All the smart objects are now selected. And I can right click and I can convert to smart object. So what I've done now is I've put all of these 3 smart objects inside another smart object. So that means I can go here, and if I want to duplicate them, hit the Alt or the Option key. Let me just hide that. And now I can start to make it look like lots and lots and lots of jets are starting to fill the sky. Let me just resize this. And let me just separate them out. Grab another one here. And now we've got more jets. Let's put these behind the other ones. And see what we're doing now is we've got a formation of jets. So now I could go through here and I could change them. I could nest them again and nest them again and nest them again. So here's the thing. Now, if I double click, watch what happens. Notice I opened up the new document. But if you look in the new document, there's our smart objects. We didn't lose them. And then if we double click, we go all the way down here. So now we've gone to 3 levels of smart objects. Let me turn this back on. I'm going to hit save. Now if I go here, notice these are updated. But if I go back here, these are not updated. Well, why did these not update? Because I haven't saved this yet. Control S. Saving is the key to updating. So once we save it, we update it, and now all of these are updating. So let me just go back here. I'm going to turn that off again, hit save. And the other way to do it too is you just close it and ask, do you want to save it? Yes, I want to save it. And boom. Now, how do you know if a document's saved or not? See this little star up here at the top? That little star means it's unsaved. Once I save a document, let me show you. See, it's not showing, nothing's changed. But once I change something, that star appears. Control S for save, the star disappears. So that's how you know if a document's been saved or not. All right, so we've got these. Okay, there's one other thing. And this is new in Photoshop 2020. And then I'm going to go have a look here at the comments and see if we've got any questions or comments, because we're getting near half time for our 1 hour show, and we'll jump into another tutorial after this. So one of the things we can do is we can right click, and we have the option now to convert to layers. What does that do? Convert to layers, click. It takes our smart objects, and there's our smart object. See what it does? It just opens that smart object and puts it into a layer group instead of being in the smart object. So if you're in the smart object and you want to change it, you know, say for example here, this is how we used to have to do it. I'll show you. Let me close this out. We used to have to double click on here, and then we would grab the layers. I'm sure you've all done this. And then we'd have to go back and drag them in here. And that was how we used to convert them. We're getting a lot of jets in here. But we don't have to do that now because we have that option to go in here and do that. So now if I want to change one of these, I don't have to go down that whole chain. I just go in here, change it, save it once, and notice only half of them are changed now. Well, how did that happen? Well, that's because these are in a different group. Remember, this other group here is pointing to these. And so we haven't saved the individual ones. So it's kind of nice that you can actually split them up. And there's another way you can do it too. So these are what we know as children, or when you change one, you change them all. If I option click and I copy the smart object like that, or I control J or copy that smart object, those are going to be the same. But if we go under, and let me see if I can remember where it is. It's smart object via copy. There we go. If I create a new smart object via copy, let's have a look at this one. Turn that off. Hit save. It's only that one is going to update. It's not going to change the rest. And let me just drag it out so you can see it. Look at that. There it is. That's the one. It was from this one. But because I created it via copy, let me explain. If you click here to duplicate it, Control J to duplicate it, you're going to create a instance, meaning that they're going to be linked to the same smart object. If you right click on here and then you choose smart object via copy, it creates a brand new smart object which is not linked. So that means if you want to change the color or something in a lot of things but not all of them, then you just copy it and then you can create a new smart object that's not going to be linked to the rest, which is going to be independent. That means when you change it, only that one is going to change. So I know we went pretty deep into smart objects there. Let me see if you guys got any questions. And then we will move into something else. Okay, let's go back just a little bit here. All right, we are discussing smart objects. And where we are, there's Rob. CS2, thank you, Pierre. That's when, oh, Pierre, how are you, man? Good to see you. So CS2 is when smart objects were added to Photoshop. Thank you for that joke. He goes, better than smart objects, smart column. That's funny. Christina, you can clone stamp on a new layer from the smart object, activate all objects in the clone option. So thanks, guys, for answering these questions. That's good. So I guess someone was asking the question, can you clone from a smart object? Yes, you can. Portrait photographer, how can I benefit from smart objects? Well, from making things non-destructive when you're applying filters and adjusting your photos. When you use those smart objects, you can go back and change things. So when you're doing healing, or maybe you're doing frequency separation or different things like that, when it's a smart object, you can go and use these smart filters, which means that if you go a little too much on a filter or something like that, you can always go back and change it later. So it's a very useful retouching tool. So if you're doing any retouching, works really well. Also, if you're doing any head swaps or anything like that, you know, sometimes you do a group photo, everyone's perfect except for that one person that's like this. You take multiple photos, take the best face from each one. You can drop them in and mask them out and replace them. It's good to use smart objects for that too, for, you know, when you're manipulating. All right, so, and I'm sure you'll find many, many other uses. And guys, drop suggestions. If you guys have got suggestions for portrait photographer, how they would use smart objects, drop it into the comments here. Smart object is a container. Good way to think of it. Thanks, Bob. And good to see you there, Bob. Let's have a look. Yes, we can use a smart object as a signature. For watermarks, I think I have a tutorial on that somewhere on YouTube where I was showing you guys how to create. Oh, no, actually, I turned it into a brush. What do we got here? The tool will work smart objects, smart objects. What do we got here? I'm just looking at the questions. Let's have a look. Many ways doing the same thing in Photoshop. Yes, there are. Just seeing if there's any questions. Russ, you're going to watch the replay. Yeah, there's a lot of information there. You might want to watch that several times. Yes, there's a bunch of third-party scripts. What do we got? Sorry, Mike. Don't worry. We are not going down the rabbit hole any deeper because I know we got pretty deep there with that. And that was just for some of the people maybe a little bit more advanced. If you're not so advanced, don't worry about that other stuff. Just stick to the stuff that we did at the beginning. And just remember, it's great that we're not losing quality when we're using the smart object. It's nice. We can use smart filters with smart objects, so it enables us to work non-destructively, and also for replicating multiple objects. Now, another time doing this multiple object thing is useful if you're doing things like snow or rain or creating, any kind of those type of effects. It works really well as well. All right, so there we go. So yeah, we can use the clone stamp. If we choose the clone stamp, and here's the thing here, and then we create a new layer, and then with the new layer under the current stamp, we change this to all layers, and then we option click there. We can use that. So I think someone had that question. That was for Greg. Yeah, so Greg, yes, you can use that with the smart object. The only thing you can't do inside a smart object is a pixel level thing. That means if you're painting, you're brushing, you can't brush or paint directly into the smart object. Of course, you can open it as that second document and you can paint in there. And the other thing, if you're stretching pixels and things like that, you can't necessarily do that for smart object. However, they've really ramped up what they can do with smart objects inside of Photoshop. So a lot of other things that didn't work before now work with smart objects. So you want to really keep current. So under filter, liquify, we can liquify smart objects. So, oh, it's a Concord. So yeah, a lot of filters. So that's the thing. A lot of things that didn't work with a smart object now do work with smart objects. And I've got one other thing I want to encourage you guys to do. If you go to photoshopCAFE, when you look at the tutorials, under free tutorials, you'll see a link under there that says super guides. The super guides are all the new features that have been added in Photoshop. So ever since Photoshop 6, I think CS2 maybe, I started doing it on Photoshop. Here, I've written tutorials for almost every single new feature that comes out in every release of Photoshop. So if you want to go back through those, you'll see a lot of things have been added in Photoshop that you might have missed. Such as, the ability to use warp and different things like that with smart objects. There's a ton of things you can do that you never used to be able to do, and they're always advancing Photoshop. So anyway, what we're going to do now, though, is we're going to move on from smart objects. Hopefully that's helped you guys. And also, I do have a tutorial there on smart objects on the YouTube channel here, and also on photoshopCAFE, where I'm using potatoes, and I'm going a little bit slower, and also because I can edit with the miracle of photo editing, video editing, I'm able to show some of these things maybe a little better than I can on a live stream. So make sure you check out that tutorial there. It's smart objects, and I think you'll learn some good things from it. All right. So why not use them all the time, Steve? Well, yeah, you pretty much should use them most of the time. Yeah, that's and a lot of my work I do too. And thanks, Rod, for checking out those super guides, because really there's so much depth of information in those super guides. You guys have no idea, and a lot of people just don't even know they're there. All right, so let's look at something else. What we're going to do now is we're going to go and all right, we're going to do a vote. We're going to do a vote here. We can go through Camera Raw, and I'm going to show you guys how to use Camera Raw, a nice workflow to make your photos look better, even really bad photos. Or I can show you guys how to use curves. Now, drop a comment. Let's have a vote on it. Because we don't have time to do both. We can do one or the other. I feel like, we've done smart objects. It was a kind of a deep, kind of cerebral, and maybe our heads are hurting. Maybe the camera raw might be a little easier, something a little more chill. Just sit back and watch it, or let me know about the curve. So let me know in the comments. I'm going to give you guys a few seconds here to drop comments and tell me what you want. Camera raw or curves? All right, so what do we got here? It's like the Fight Club. And those who know can't tell. All right, camera raw, camera raw. Oh, here we go, camera raw, camera raw. All right, 72. Are we talking about pixel? Yep, Rod's bang on. 72 is for online, 300 for print. Of course, that's a little different if you're using a Retina display on an iPhone or something like that, because it will change the size. All right, let us use the camera raw because this is just okay. All right, guys, you can stop voting. Everyone wants camera raw. All right, let's do it. ACR, click open, and we're just going to open this camera raw. This is the original image. Now, so I'm going to show you my workflow, how I like to work inside of in camera raw. Now, there's a couple of things you could have. You could have a raw file, or you could have a JPEG. They all work in camera raw. And one of the things you'll know if you click under here, under white balance, if you see all these settings, the same settings that were on your camera, that means we're working with a raw document. You won't get that in a JPEG. And you can also see down here the name ACR CR2. That is a Canon camera. It would be a NEF if it was shot on a Nikon camera. And it would be ARW, I believe, on a Sony camera. I should know that because I have a Sony A7 III as an alpha raw file, I guess. So you'll see the name there. It could be a DNG. It could be a RAF if you're using the, what do you call those little cameras? The Fujis. Anyway, so you can go in and change these. So when you shoot in RAW, let me just give you a 2-second of why you would want to shoot in RAW. One of them, obviously, is we see these settings here are maintained, and we can change them later. So when you shoot with a camera, and I just feel like I need to hold a camera in my hand when I do this. I don't know why. Just, I guess, because we've got the webcam as we use it. Okay, so if you've got a camera and you're shooting and you set it to RAW, basically the only things that are going to be written into that file are going to be your aperture setting. You can't change that after the fact. It's going to be your ISO and your shutter speed. So basically all your optics and your focus, of course, which is part of your optics as well. You can't change that. But white balance, exposure, all these other settings you can change afterwards. So it gives you that flexibility. Also, a RAW file is a higher bit depth. It's a 16-bit image, usually contains 12 or 10 or 12 bits of information. What does that mean? It just means it holds a lot of colors and a lot of detail compared to a JPEG, which is only 8-bit. So it means you can adjust it and it doesn't fall apart or it doesn't lose quality as quickly. All right, let's go through the workflow of adjusting this. Now, this would be exactly the same for a JPEG, except we can't go in here in white balance. And of course, the quality on the JPEG is not going to be as good. Okay, so I can change this white balance. Why don't we try, like, maybe, I should have tried cloudy. You can see that's what it looks like in cloudy if I'd set the cloudy setting to my camera. This is exactly the same as if I'd set that on the field. So when people are really emphasizing about, setting your white balance and making sure you get your white balance right on field, if you're using a preset white balance, it doesn't matter. The only time it would really matter is if you're actually calibrating on the spot. You're using a grid card. Let me show you one. Here's an X5 color checker. You guys familiar with these? And inside we have a gray. It's 18% gray, and we have a white. Now we also have different colors in here. So you can actually shoot these and create a profile and do profile corrections. That's another topic for another day. But if, for example, let me just push this thing down here, open it, and you shoot and you use a gray card or a white card to white balance your camera on location, then you can use a custom white balance, and your white balance is going to be absolutely accurate. And that would be a time when I would worry about it. But the other thing you could do is just hold this card up in one of your photos, take one shot with this in front of it, and as long as the light doesn't change, which sunset it does, so you might have to do it a few times, you can go back in and you can find that gray card in the shot and create a custom white balance from that. So hopefully that wasn't too technical, but so essentially what you're going to do is go in here, find your white balance, and that would be custom if we chosen a custom on the camera. The other thing we could do is, say we had shot a gray card, you would just grab this little white balance tool here, there's the eyedropper, and then you just would click it on the gray card. So here's an area of gray, let's pretend that's a gray card, click on it, and that's going to set the white balance, just because I knew that was gray. Or maybe this pipe here is gray. So you click on that card and that will create that custom white balance. And notice wherever I click, it's going to change the white balance to make wherever I click become a neutral gray. Sometimes the clouds are good, they can be gray. This time of the day it's a little tough. Actually, you see that nice warm sunset? It's not bad, but I'm going to go back here and I'm just going to use cloudy for now. No, I don't like the cloudy at all. Wow, it didn't look good. Okay, let's have a look at daylight. You know what? I'm just going to click because I like this better. So let's click there. I think we got a better white balance just by using that gray point. All right, so that's the first thing you want to do. Then what you want to do is go under Profile here. And you'll notice on the camera right now it's using Adobe Color. So if we click on these little squares, it's going to open some things. And if I go under the camera matching, you might know, or maybe you don't know, but there are profiles inside your camera. So these are the different profiles of Canon. So if I'd wanted to shoot with the neutral and I didn't shoot it at the time, I can choose it here. Now Adobe's gone ahead and built their own because they figured, you know what, those are good, but we think we can do some better. And you know what, sometimes the Adobe ones, like the Adobe Standard, they work really well, and other times they don't, but it's nice to have these options. The other options is we can go down here and there's some creative ones. Modern, artistic, vintage, you've probably seen all of these. You can see those in there. And so you could try some of these just by rolling over them and just finding an overall profile. And then we just hit close. Now you can create your own profiles way beyond what we're doing here, but of course I have created a tutorial, so check it out on the YouTube channel there on working with these profiles and creating your own. I've done videos on those before. Okay, let's move on. So we've got our color right. That's basically what we did is we just set our color. Now the next thing we need to do is fix our exposure. Now we've got different panels here inside of Lightroom. This basic panel we're working on right now, this is where we do our color correction, all that kind of stuff. I'm noticing it's kind of tilted and it's a little weird. So I can fix that too. So if I go under here, we can use the lens correction. And I'm going to enable a profile correction. Notice it gets rid of that warping on the horizon. This is what it looked like before, afterwards. So it knows what the Canon camera I was using was a 5D. It knows what lens I was using, and it applies this profile automatically, gets rid of that warping. Because it was at 1740, very wide lens, causing that fisheye. Now I want to level it, so I'll just grab a level tool, and I just click and drag. That's our horizon, release it, and all I got to do is just click back to our basic and hit enter. Now we're applying that, and now we've straightened it and got rid of the distortion. All right. Next thing we want to do is set our brightness. So if you look under here, you've got a couple of different sets here. Notice a lot in Photoshop, you're going to find things are in groups. This little panel here, this is the color group. If I wanted to slightly warm that up, I could just pull that up just a little bit, just make it look warmer, a little more sunny. You can do that. Then there's this group here. This is our brightness. This is our luminance. So we're going to do up our brights and our darks. And then down here, we're dealing with sharpening kind of effects and which is a texture, clarity, dehaze, and you'll see what that does. And then Vibrance, of course, is punching the color. How much punch do you want in the color? All right, so why don't we go down here? So the first thing I generally do is I'm going to take these highlights up really high. Now what the highlight and the shadows do is they recover. So I'm trying to recover a little bit of this. This is obviously clipped. If we click on here, you can see it's clipped, which means that all the details blown out in that area. So pulling the highlight back will recover as much as we can, and we're seeing some here. I mean, I could pull the exposure back a little bit and see, you know what, wow, there are actual pixels there. So that camera did not completely blow it out, but we'll come back to that. The next thing we want to do is open up the shadows. Now, a lot of people will open it all the way up and then just kind of go into exposure here and pull it down, which we could, but I feel like, when you get that fake, and I've seen a lot of it, the kind of the fake HDR effect, you get that by pulling the shadows up too high. And I see that a lot. It's okay if you want to do it, but sometimes you just want to watch that a little bit and don't get too carried away because it can look artificial. All right, so then we've set, and what I did there is I just pulled the exposure up just a little bit was the next thing. Just setting an overall brightness just to make this image appealing. All right, so then we've got whites and blacks. What do whites and blacks do? Whites and blacks enable us to bring back or push that back in. Because sometimes, when we start to recover too much with the shadow, and it's not really happening in this image, but you can get the whites can look milky and they lack punch. You can increase the white to fix that. See what I'm doing? Maybe push it up a little bit. We're losing some up here, but don't worry, we'll come back to that. And then the blacks. If we're not seeing any blacks, look at a histogram on the left-hand side. We're not really got good blacks. If we pull this in a little bit, it's going to give us punch. It's going to give us body in the photo. And sometimes you work in black and white, you might plug it up quite a lot. In this case, why don't we hold down the Alt or the Option key, and as we move it, it shows us where the clipping is going to be. See that? Where it shows that clipping means that that's going to go to pure black and lose all detail. And I'm okay with it there. So I'm doing it about that much, which is quite a lot. Now, we have a contrast slider. If we push the contrast, it makes the image look punchy. If we pull it to the left, it makes the image look soft. And it actually shows more dynamic range or more detail in shadows and highlights when you pull it down, but it looks washed out. If we pull the contrast all the way up, it's punchy and snappy, but we lose details in the blacks and in the whites or the highlights in the shadow regions. So a lot of the time, I will use this as a fine tune at the very, very end. Because the whites and blacks together do the same thing as the contrast, but you have separate control over your whites and blacks, whereas contrast moves everything together. So that kind of gives you that little bit. And also the whites and blacks tend to be more at the extreme range. And in fact, if you go up here, you can see, look at the histogram. As I'm rolling over, it shows in that writing under there where we are. Whites, highlights, exposure, shadows, and blacks. But rather than thinking of it that way, think of a highlight and shadow as recovery, and whites and blacks is taking those extremes and just punching or just nipping those blacks and just nipping those whites. That's kind of how I like to think of it there. All right, so now that we've kind of worked with those a little bit, someone asking about the clipping. Yep, we see clipping up here. Don't worry, we're going to come back to that. So the next thing I want to do maybe is the sky. I can't make this look good and make the sky look good at the same time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my gradient here. And with the gradient, I'm just going to click and drag down. I'll hold the Shift key to keep that constrained because otherwise it's impossible to try and get it level. So if you want to level it, hold down the Shift key. And notice what's happening. Now I've created a gradient. And you can't really tell, but if I go here with the exposure all the way down, notice what's happening. Everything on the side of the green is affected, everything on the side of the red is unaffected, and a gradient happens between the two. In this case, I'm creating a very, very sharp, quick gradient so I can adjust there. So let me just double click that exposure. and just kind of reset that. Now, sometimes what I'll do is, this has got the previous settings. If you click up on here, you can choose to reset. So now that's reset the gradient. So both sides are identical. It hasn't changed anything. A lot of the time I like to start there. And now I'm going to take my highlights and I'm going to pull the highlights all the way down. What I've done essentially is I've now doubled the effectiveness of the highlight recovery because we used it first on the image and now we're using it again on the overlay. So if you want to go further than what you can, just apply a gradient overlay and you can do that. All right, so let's take the exposure down a little bit. See how now we're starting to darken that sky. We can play around with that contrast a little bit. Let's take the whites. I'm going to take the whites down. And now what's happening, look at this. Now we see the detail starting to appear here in the sunset. Now we can blend this over a period like this, or we could blend it up here, but it's not going to work in this case because we've got that area. Now, let me show you something that's interesting. If I don't want to affect everything, if I just take this and I take that down, it's a little too much everywhere else, but it's looking good here. Well, here's the thing. We can go under brush. And if I choose this brush, I can paint away. So if I hold the Alt or the Option key, let me get that just a little smaller, left bracket key. See what I'm doing? I can paint that away. So now I'm brushing here, and I'm only affecting that one area there now. So what I've done is I essentially used that filter to just affect that one area by using that brush, and I can paint things away. Now, if I feel like, maybe it was a little much, like I got a little carried away, I can apply that brush. Let's go down under the, I don't know how much control I'm going to have here. I might not have the control I want. So this is how I would have to do it. Let me undo it again. This time I'm going to take the flow down lower. And now as I paint, see, it's painting it out, but not as much. So with a lower flow, you can just reduce a little bit more. So you're not completely painting it out now. All right, so that's using the gradient. And I just choose any other tool, we'll apply it. So we've got that gradient going. And if you ever want to go back to it, click on there and you'll see those points. And that white area is the area where that gradient was. But now we make any more adjustments, the adjustments are going to apply to the whole image, including the area we worked with the gradient. So a newer slider in here is texture. It used to be clarity, and everyone would push the clarity up here and see how it makes things look sharper and better. Brings out some detail. But now I'd like to start with the texture and see how it works a little different. What the texture does is it brings out the texture in the photo, but it's not affecting the color tones as much. See that? So it doesn't give it that faux HDR. So I'm going to pull this up. It's almost like sharpening, but it's not, because we're enhancing the texture. The sharpening tends to hit more the edges, whereas the texture is going to hit the whole photograph and just bring out that detail there. Now we can give it a little touch of clarity if we want. And usually when you do that, you might have to tweak the exposure because sometimes it darkens it. Dehaze also works good, if it's looking a little hazy or foggy. And let's just see where we are right now. Because if I want to hit the P key, that's before and that's after. And you can see how much change we've done there on this photo. One last thing I like to do sometimes is reduce the saturation just a little bit and increase the vibrance just a little bit. And then what the vibrance does is saturation changes the amount of color across the whole image. Vibrance takes the areas that are less saturated, adds more color to them, and in the areas that are already saturated, it leaves them alone so your colors don't clip or get overblown. Now, another thing I sometimes like to do too is to go under some of these other settings. One of them I like is HSL. So with the HSL, I can adjust the hue, saturation, and luminance of these different areas. So we can get these areas of the oranges there. If we go under Luminance, see how I can darken that? Same with the yellows. We can lighten or darken, so the flowers here maybe. We can lighten or darken those. I got to be a little careful because when I do that with the yellows, I can clip this because it's also got yellows in there. But we can also increase the saturation of those. So yellows, oranges, the greens. One that's going to have a big difference. Watch this. The blues, I could just take all the color out of the sky, or I could add it. That's the water in the sky. But what makes a huge difference is luminance. A lot of the time, if I only do one thing with HSL, it's to make these skies look bluer. And the way to do that is go under Luminous, which is lightness and darkness, take the blues, darken them a little bit. And it just adds a little bit more to them. And maybe just give them a touch of saturation. So if we look at this before and after, you know, that's working there inside of there. And then we could click open image. And that's working in Camera Raw. All right, so let's have a look at some questions. Wow, we're up to 166 people on here right now. That's great. So let's have a look at some questions, guys, and see what we've got, because we're definitely nearing the end of our time. Oh, you couldn't see the lower right control. I am very sorry about that. Oh, of course, my face was over it. My apologies about that, guys. I should have looked at that a little bit earlier. Let me just quickly show you what I did. Let me go here, images, go Camera Raw, and let's just see what was hidden. So yeah, take a sec for this to update because there's a little delay on here, and let's see how much was hidden. I'm so sorry, guys. I wish there was a way you could alert and send a sound on these chats. Waiting. It's just gonna take a sec. Okay, so what did we lose? Okay, dehaze. Okay, so we only lost vibrance and saturation. Okay, so let me just show you quickly. If I pull it up, should be up here with the overlay there. Yeah, so you can see everything there except for the vibrance and the saturation. So all I did is saturation makes the whole image look more saturated, more color, or less. And it just moves it across in a linear fashion. If we use vibrance, notice what happens. As I pull it down, see how the more saturated areas like the yellow there doesn't move as quickly as some of the less saturated areas such as the blues in the sky. Same thing as I increase it. Notice the sky will increase much faster in the water than the yellows here. So it knows the areas that are already got saturation and it tries not to overdo them. So it kind of protects it for you. And it also protects skin tones. So anyway, let's see what you guys have got here.